Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Smithson. I am the treasurer of the Women Lawyers Association of Michigan, and I am so pleased today that we are gathered together to celebrate Women's History Month with Rachel Dranowski, the coordinator of the Michigan Supreme Court Learning Center. She's going to talk with us today about the first three female justices to the Michigan Supreme Court: Justice Mary Stallings Coleman, Dorothy Comstock Riley, and Patricia Boyle. Rachel earned her master's degree in public history from Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. Her background is in museums, historical research and writing, and civic education. She's been with the Learning Center since 2004. If you have not been there before, the Learning Center is a museum-style gallery inside the Michigan Hall of Justice. And right now, it currently offers virtual programs and educational resources, but hopefully it will be back to in-person tours and programs next month. If there are no issues, please take it away, Rachel.
Hey, thank you so much, Nicole. I'm so excited to be here. This is a project that I really enjoyed. As you mentioned, I'm a historian, and so I love doing all this research into people that I feel like I know because I know people who knew them. Today I'm going to work, as you mentioned, I'm going to talk about the 3 women justices that were first on the Michigan Supreme Court, and I want to put them in context, not only of today, but also of the past, to understand exactly how groundbreaking they were. If you have questions, there's going to be time where I'm going to stop and we'll have a little time to address any of those throughout the program. And then there likely will be time at the end if there were some overall questions as well. And I know Nicole's going to help me out with that. So the women that I'm talking about are going to be started in the 1970s working for the court. But today, it's significant to note that we have our 4th majority of women on the court. There are 7 justices, as you probably know, and 4 of them are women. And when Chief Justice McCormick was asked about that, she thought it was significant for kids to see women in those sorts of roles. And Michigan really is ahead of its peers in many ways in this aspect, that not only is it the 4th time in history we've had a female majority, but there are courts in the United States that have never had more than 1 woman on at a time, including Indiana. They've only had a total of 2 women, and they didn't serve concurrently. Michigan has had a total of 13 women who have been on our court, and that's one of the top 2, tied with Washington State. So it really is in part due to these 3 women that I'm going to talk about. And the women are Mary S. Coleman, Justice Dorothy Comstock Riley, and Justice Patricia Boyle. And they are inspirations for a lot of women. You read judges who have talked about that. They look back on who they were as people as well as the decisions they make. And these women faced strong opposition. And interestingly enough, when I was looking at the dates, they all served within my own lifetime. So it was not that long ago that it was an all-male domain on our Supreme Court. I want to talk about not only their careers, but also tell them stories of them as people, mostly through stories that they shared about themselves or their families have. Going back in time, it wasn't until the 1870s to 1890s when women first became lawyers in the United States. It was the first time that women were allowed to go to universities and attend law school. And the photo that I have here is of Martha Strickland. She was the first woman who was listed as of counsel on a Michigan Supreme Court case. She was a suffragist and was interested in women's rights. And in fact, this case, Wilson v. Newton, was about women's rights. The question was whether a woman could serve as a deputy to an elected position, even though she could not serve in the position because she couldn't vote yet. Incidentally, our Michigan Supreme Court said yes. So she must have, her input must have been persuasive. Moving forward in time just a little bit more, we kind of jump ahead in the 1920s. That was the next time there was a big bump in the scheme of things, a bump in women seeking legal careers. It was, you can think of it as the flapper era, but it was also when women earned the right to vote in national elections. It was the first time that women in all of the states could become members of the bar. And even though they could become lawyers, it was actually fairly difficult for them to find positions that in large part, they couldn't serve in any big law firms. And if they did, it was as, you know, people were looking for stenographers and legal secretaries, maybe librarians. The one area that they might have some areas that they could do some leadership would be in public service. And a lot of times what women would do is they hang out their own shingle, or they would join their family law firm. Move forward to the next decade, of course, is the 1930s. In the 30s, we have the economic downturn and the Great Depression, another reason not to hire women. By the 40s, there were a few women who might be considered Rosie the Riveters. The men were drafted for World War II, and somebody had to do the work. And in big law firms, lo and behold, they weren't necessarily hiring new people. They were discovering those librarians they had hired were able to do that sort of legal work. So there were a few people who got more responsibilities at that time. This is about when that Mary S. Coleman was starting her career. But by the 1950s and 1960s, the men returned from war. The expectation was that women would go back to their homes and not be working out in the community anymore. So it again began to be difficult to find a legal career. And this is about the time when Justice Riley and Justice Boyle were starting their careers. So that gives you a little bit of context for who these women were and where they sort of entered the field. Here we have Mary S. Coleman is the first justice I'm going to talk about. She was the first woman on the Michigan Supreme Court. She was also the first woman Chief Justice of our court. And she was a trailblazer in that way as well, because her colleagues were the ones who selected her. So they were looking for that sort of leadership, even though she was the only woman on the court at the time until the very last few weeks that she served. So that's kind of an interesting part of that story. Her early years were very influential on her choice of career. These are her parents. Leslie Stallings was her father. He came to the practice of law the typical way. He went to law school at the University of Texas. Quite ambitious man, but he ended up with a brain ailment of some sort and died quite young, in his mid-40s, when Mary S. Coleman was only in her teens. That left her mother, Agnes Stallings, to keep the family going. And her mother came to legal work through a different route. She joined the Department of Justice through the civil service. And the photo that you see here is actually when she made national news. She worked for the Department of Justice in the 1920s, upholding the Volstead Act during Prohibition. And she was busting brewers who were brewing beer that was too strong. If you're interested, you can find, there is actually, recently, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but there is a book about that case that she made big news on. But Mary S. Coleman was born in Texas, but spent almost all of her formative years in Washington, D.C., and that's how her mother ended up working for the Department of Justice. So she had some connections. The family had connections to the Washington elite. In her oral history, she talks about having gone to the White House with her mother to some parties that the Roosevelts threw. Eleanor Roosevelt, who of course was interested in women's rights, at one point had suggested that women should serve on the United States Supreme Court. And apparently one of the names that came up was Agnes Stallings. Of course, that didn't go anywhere, but it sort of ended up that later in life, Mary S. Coleman was on the list to perhaps be the first woman on the United States Supreme Court. Of course, it was Sandra Day O'Connor that did that, but it was thought of way back in the 1930s. The other interesting story that Justice Coleman likes to talk about is when she was in her teens, she wanted to enter a speech contest and talk about Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. She had done a lot of research on him, but couldn't just get those last few details. And so her mother said, well, why don't you just call him up and see if he'll talk to you? So in that spirit of forging ahead and doing everything she could to be prepared, she did make that phone call, and she said he was extraordinarily gracious to her, which she only realized later in life as a young person. She didn't realize what a big deal that was, apparently. So kind of interesting stories about her early life. She ended up, after she graduated from high school, she put herself through the University of Maryland and went on to law school. And that's where she met her husband. This photo was taken later in life in their, after they were married and living back in Michigan. But they met in law school, and they graduated in 1939, and she was able to do some practice of law with him. Or she didn't practice with him, but they both were practicing before he went off, drafted for World War II. He had been a trust buster. And so after the war, he was sent to Berlin to denazify the German economy. And she went to join him. At that point, they had one child, and she was very pregnant with the second one. And she somehow got herself on a boat and got there, and ended up staying until the conditions ended up being too difficult. She left during the Berlin airlift when the Russians were cutting off supplies. So she comes back home, needs a place to go, and ends up in Marshall, Michigan. It was his hometown. And it ended up, that was sort of a, not necessarily where they thought they were going to be, but it ended up where they stayed was in Calhoun County. When her husband Creighton came home from Europe, he ended up having made some connections in the Republican Party, was asked to run for state legislature. And at the same time, because the legislature was only part-time, and they needed a way to support the family, someone helped him, a friend of theirs helped him to establish a law firm that they both ran in Calhoun County. So here he is, he goes off to Lansing and is the legislator. She stays home during the daytime. She's the 1950s mom with her two young children. And at night, she's making sure that their law firm is doing what needs to happen in order to move forward there. So running sort of a dual life. By the late 1950s, early 1960s, both she and her husband decide maybe becoming a judge is the way to go. So he becomes a circuit court judge. She decides she's really interested in children, so she becomes a juvenile referee, a quasi-judicial position. At the time, probate courts are where juvenile cases are handled. And so she works for the probate judge who is nearing retirement. Within a couple of years, he says, why don't you run for my position? So it was the first time there was a woman that ran for the position, and she won. The one person who didn't like it was her opponent, of course. And the opponent says, well, what happens if there's an appeal? Because of course, some probate appeals go to the circuit court. Luckily, they were able to say, it won't go to her husband because there was more than one circuit court judge. They had a way around it. But it was brought up, and as she was running for election, then she was very well respected as a probate judge, and in fact, she became the head of the Probate Judges Association in Michigan, and that in turn helped lead her to run for the Michigan Supreme Court. By 1973, she's been a probate court judge for a while. And she was kind of thinking about doing it. And then there was a decision that came down from the court at the time that had to do with juveniles. She thought, they need my perspective, and decides to run. This is the time of the Equal Rights Amendment and the next wave of feminists. She was older than those new wave of feminists, but she did, of course, believe that women should be in leadership positions. So she gets on the court, and in 1976 was the year of the woman, and you can see the statistic there. She was on a national commission that did a bunch of research in all different aspects of life as a woman in the United States at the time. And what was discovered and is reported is that of the 932 state appellate court judges in the nation, only 12 of them were women, including Justice Coleman there. And looking at that statistic, that's pretty amazing. And I actually looked it up, and I found that by 1979, she had become the Chief Justice, which, as you can see, she was pretty happy about that. You see the bench photo that was taken with her beaming, sitting in the center there. But at this point, even today, there are 11 states that still have not had a female Chief Justice. So that indicates that we are in Michigan still ahead of the curve on that. By 1982, she's ready to retire. Her husband is retiring from his judgeship, and so she decides to leave the court. It ends up being a controversial time, in part because she is leaving, but that's the next story that I'll tell. Sort of to wrap up talking about Justice Coleman, she was asked, of course, along the way, being a first, she was asked, what did it feel like to be the only woman in the room so often? And how did you get there? And although she did talk a little bit about knowing that she had to be one of the boys in some way, she actually had several stories about, she used logic, that she told a story about the first time that she appeared in front of a particular judge early in her career. And she said she was so well prepared. And then the judge told her afterwards that he so appreciated that she was just logical and went through her case, and not like that other woman who was in histrionics before she did that. That she did all right. I'm sure in a sort of patronizing way that came across. Later, when she was running for the Michigan Supreme Court, she talked about how she had to convince all these rural voters. She's going out all over Michigan, conservative voters, not sure at this era that a woman should be running for office at the state level like this. But she said, I just told them in the logical form why they should vote for me, and they must have. And then the last story that I have here, you can see this. You can see this quote here. This was actually, she was asked about her time on the court and how did you manage? You were the only woman for most of the time. And here again, she talks about logic and reasonableness. But she said at the end of the quote, you can see she had to work very hard and know what she was doing. And by all accounts, she did. So I'm going to sort of stop here in case there are any questions. I know that Nicole had a few things that we were actually talking about at the beginning before everybody signed on.
Yes. So Rachel, if you don't mind, can you talk a little bit about how the fact that Justice Coleman started her career in a small town on the west side of the state impacted her ascension to the Supreme Court?
Sure. I think part of it had to do with went back to her husband's hometown. His family had lived there a while, and he had made all of those connections through his, he had been a state legislator and all of that. But she also had the opportunity to take on leadership roles in a small community. She talked about how she had never been a member of the AAUW, but they asked her to be president immediately. So, she was involved in community theater at different points and things like that. So she was really able to take that small community and really be a leader at that point already. And then also going back to her husband's connections, when she decided she was going to run for the Michigan Supreme Court, it was very late in the game. It was right before the convention was going to happen, but she had made the connection through helping out her husband with someone named Ellie Peterson, her biography is subtitled something like The Mother of the Republican Party or something like that. She was a woman who in the 50s through the early 80s was really a mover and shaker in the Republican Party. And when Mary S. Coleman said, I want to run, Ellie Peterson, I'm going to help you. And so through that sort of organization, she did. So I think it was a combination of who she was, but also crafting where she was and making the most of it.
Yeah, I just think it's so interesting because if you look at a lot of legal firsts for Michigan women, they tend to happen for women who are in the Detroit area. And so it's just very interesting to me that someone, from this tiny town made it all the way to the Supreme Court first. It looks like we don't have any questions in the chat. If anyone has anything that they'd like to ask right now, feel free to either come off mute or go ahead and send me a chat. Otherwise, I guess we'll continue.
Sure. I'm going to go right ahead because there's going to be other times, and I'm certainly welcome to, if you think of something later or if something else comes up in the chat, I'm certainly willing to do that. But of course, our next justice is Justice Dorothy Comstock Riley. Not only was she the second woman on the Michigan Supreme Court, she was the first woman to serve as a judge on the Michigan Court of Appeals. She was also the first Latina elected to any Supreme Court in the nation. She was about 10 years younger than Marius Coleman. There were a number of similarities between her, but there are also some differences as well. Her early years, one of the interesting things is that her name reflects her father's Irish and English heritage. He was Charles Comstock Jr., grew up in Detroit, and he was an auto worker. And so Justice Riley grew up in a blue-collar household. Her mother, interestingly enough, Josephine, I'm guessing is how she might have pronounced it when she was living in the United States. But she actually was a trailblazer on her own, in her own right. She came to the United States to go to nursing school, and you see her in her nursing uniform there. That's a picture of her. Right before World War I, and wanted to go overseas as soon as she finished up her nursing degree, but couldn't do that because she was apparently very petite. She wasn't tall enough to make the standards of being able to serve overseas in World War I. She ended up staying here and helped out. There was, of course, the 1918 flu pandemic, and then she ended up in Detroit at a hospital helping men recover from war wounds overseas. That's actually where she met Charles, and they ended up getting married. So it ended up being okay that she stayed in the Detroit area for herself personally, but also for Michigan. Justice Riley, I think, inherited not only her mother's petite stature. Everybody who talks about Justice Riley talks about what just a petite woman she was, less than 5 foot tall, not even 100 pounds. And some of the same stories are about her mother. But also I think she inherited her mother's sheer determination. The other stories that are talked about Justice Riley is she was a teenager, already knew she wanted to be a lawyer, and her parents, interestingly enough, were very supportive of this. She was a studious child, and they thought that it might be a good fit for her. But similar to the story with Justice Coleman, Justice Riley ended up putting herself through her undergraduate years and law school. She went to Wayne State University, graduated in 1949, found it extraordinarily difficult to find a job. And in fact, her first job out of law school was interpreting price controls for a department store. That's what the photo is of there, is the department store she worked for about a year. And then when she was looking for law jobs, they wanted to know, how fast can you type? Maybe you should join the steno pool. Eventually she decided, I'm not going to play that game, and went into private practice. Then by the end of the 1950s, she joins the front of the court as an investigator, making sure that divorced fathers are paying their child support. And she was still living with her parents in the late 1950s, in fact. It was about this time that she was the president of the Women's Lawyers Association. And some of you might know the story about how she thought it had become too much of a social club. She thought that they should be trying to break into the power structure of the local bar. Instead, they were setting tables and winning those kind of contests. And in her speech as the president of the organization, she suggested it should disband. Obviously, it has not. But it was something, and I think that is actually as much a comment on the expectations of women in that time period as anything. About the same time, she was having what was described as a careful and long courtship with the man she eventually married, Wallace Riley. He was a lawyer. They met in the local Young Lawyers Association, and he was an important person in his own right. He had he was president in his career. He was president of the American Bar Association as well as the State Bar of Michigan. They went into private practice together, and they worked together until she became a judge. Interestingly, she didn't get married until she was 39, and they had one child, and she was 42 when he was born. The story is that she was really interested in still working, so her mother, who had been widowed at the time, moved in and made sure that the child was cared for, so the Rileys could keep their law practice going. Of the people I'm talking about in this presentation, Justice Riley, Mr. Riley was the only person that I have actually met. And I knew him when he was in his 80s. He was still a man who would fill the doorway when he walked in. I remember a particular meeting where he was coming in, that was sort of what struck me. You know, everybody talked about, you know, how petite she was. But even after she had been gone more than 10 years, you could tell he still adored her. And from this photo, I think the feeling was mutual that they supported each other both personally and professionally. Moving forward, by 1972, Justice Riley gets appointed to the Circuit Court of Wayne County. And in 1976, she joins the Court of Appeals as the first woman on the Michigan Court of Appeals. And this might be kind of hard to see, but the bench photo from 1978, I had to take a picture of the photo, but you can see that for whatever reason, when they took this bench photo, you can see that she's in the very center, and it really highlights the fact that she's the only woman. I can't tell if she might be standing. That first row is seated. She's standing. She's much shorter than the men on either side of her, and she's standing, you know, in front of the two tallest men in the room. And it really just emphasizes, you know, she was the woman, but she's standing tall in that photo. I really enjoy that photo there of that was taken of the bench. By 1982, she's ready to move up. She ran for the Supreme Court, but lost very narrowly. And when she ended up joining the court, it was by appointment. But what happened, if you don't already know the story, is that it was not only a judicial election year, it was a gubernatorial election year. Governor Milliken was the outgoing governor. He was a lame duck. There had been, during the judicial election, one of the justices, Justice Blair Moody, had been reelected to his position for another 8 years. He suddenly unexpectedly died several days after the election. So there was the end of his term that he was filling, and then that new term. Milliken decided that he was going to appoint Justice Riley to fill that vacant seat in the last days of his term, and she joined the court. When the new governor, Governor Blanchard, came in, he said, I don't think that she should be serving past January 1, and it came before the Michigan Supreme Court. What do we do with this? It ended up that she left the court. The whole thing was protracted and not handled particularly deftly, and it really attracted the attention of the public in a way that judicial elections and appointments don't always. And in fact, Justice Boyle, and we'll talk more about her in that section, when she was running for a retention to the Supreme Court, she'd go and speak, and all anybody wanted to talk about was Justice Riley. And I have a quote from Justice Boyle. It says, "Nothing so riveted the public as the image of this little gracious woman having been kicked around by all these men." That Justice Riley left the court, but she didn't take that lying down. She decided she was coming back. So she ran in 1984 and won big, rejoined the court, and in fact became Chief Justice, named by her colleagues within a few years. So she was able to make that transition. And she, as Justice Boyle referred to her, was very gracious. And as she served as Chief Justice on the court, she kept her high standards, not only for herself, but her colleagues as well. 1997, she ends up retiring from the court. She had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and a very private person, but her health was being reported in the media. She was having trouble falling and things like that. So she chose to leave. It must have been extraordinarily hard for her. but she kept her dignity throughout. And sort of to wrap up her section, the idea, if logic was the watchword that I came up with for Justice Coleman, striving and precision are the two things that struck me with Justice Riley's story. This is a quote about hang in there until you're better than you are. That was, what would you say, it was an article about women in the law, and what would you tell young women who want to be a lawyer if they're being told they can't do it? So there's that. But then there's also all these stories about she was just meticulous and precise. And if you look in the bottom corner of her portrait here, there is a clock, and there's a reason for that. That she was always making sure that her colleagues were getting their opinions in on time, but also the clerk of the court crier at the time, as you probably know, appellate arguments are timed, and typically in the Supreme Court, the crier is the one who keeps track of the clock. Well, apparently she also kept track, and if she thought that the time was up, even if the crier hadn't said it was time, you went with what the chief had to say. So I think that's kind of a funny story about sort of an indication of how she ran things. I'm going to sort of stop here, and if there are any questions.
Yeah, we have a couple. Do you know what Justice Riley did during that interim period between her two Supreme Court terms?
It was, I don't know if she actually went back. I mean, her husband they still had the firm. So I don't know if she went back and was helping out at the firm, but it was not, I mean, she left in 83 and ran in 84, and it was sort of in the news already. So I'm not sure how much of that time she would have spent concentrating on campaigning as well. That it was early on indicated that she was planning to run. So my guess is it would have been natural for her to go back and help out their firm. So, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay. And did the fact that she was a Latina impact her journey to the Supreme Court?
That wasn't necessarily part of the story until much later. Anything I've read about her, she doesn't talk about her mother being from Mexico. Her mother, like early on, used her service in World War I to get to become a citizen of the United States. So I'm guessing part of the story was her mother worked extraordinarily hard at the time to become an American. And even like you read the biographies that were written of Justice Riley, that the articles that they talk about, coming to the court, it had to do with, she left the court and all that. And that it wasn't the first reference I see to her mother being from Mexico is actually her mother's obituary. And I would presume the family is the one that supplied that. So, but that wasn't until 1993. Her mother died at 101. So really, I don't think that was necessarily talked about, that wasn't part. I don't know if how much her mother would have maintained her, her home culture and all of that kind of thing. So it wasn't an issue, but it wasn't necessarily talked about in the same way as in politics today.
Okay. And it looks like there are no other questions in the chat. If you want to move on to Justice Boyle.
Sure, I'll move forward to her. Justice Boyle was, of course, the third woman on the Michigan Supreme Court. And one of the things that always gets mentioned with her is that she had a lifetime appointment to the federal bench first, and then came back to serve on the Michigan Supreme Court. She was more than 20 years younger than Justice Coleman and more than 10 years younger than Justice Riley. So in some ways, I think her outlook on life was different, partially because of who she was, but I think some of that was generational, just being that much younger than the other two women. Her early Her early years, her parents were from Canada. They were both English-speaking Canadians, came over. I presume her father worked for the auto industry, so I assume they came for that. Her mother was they would have been called a homemaker at the time. But when she was asked about it, Justice Boyle said, you know, if my mother would have had the opportunity to have further her education, she probably would have been a career woman, that she really respected her mother's intellect and her mother's advice too. There were different times in life when she talked about how her mother had helped her think through things. Justice Boyle grew up in Detroit near Cooley High School, and that's a photo here. And that's where she attended high school. And she became involved in the Young Democrats as a teen. They were active nearby, and these became important connections for her early career. She was known to be quite intelligent and went off to the University of Michigan and spent some time in the education department. But because that was sort of, if you were a woman in this era, you were either going to become a teacher or you're going to become a nurse. And she got quite disenchanted with the idea of becoming a teacher. So she decided she was going to get married. But then soon after, she realized that she wanted to do other things too. Talked to her mother, and mother said, well, why don't you go back to school? Wayne State had a program where you could earn your bachelor's and your JD at the same time. So she did that. And so by the time she finishes law school, she has 3 babies. I just can't imagine this. She still managed to graduate at the top of her class. And when she was asked about, she was only one of a handful of women in her law class. When she was asked about it, she said, well, at the beginning, the males all froze me out. They just didn't take me seriously till they realized that I was earning the best grades. And then they said, hey, we want you in her study groups. So, really she excelled at what she did. Early in her career, she found like the other 2 women, she had trouble, well, like Justice Riley especially, she had trouble finding a position as a lawyer. She found the law search for a law job both sad and infuriating. She was quite sensitive about her looks, and she got many comments about, well, you're not good enough looking to threaten the women, our wives. And so maybe we could hire you. When she did get close to being hired, she found out that she was going to be offered a lot less money than a fellow classmate who was male. Ended up not getting any of those jobs, but she did finally get a job as a part-time temporary clerking position for the federal courts, in part because she had babysat for someone as a teenager that was in this young Democrats group that she had gotten to know. But she didn't just slough off. She managed to parlay that into a position at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and then later for the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. It's while she was in Wayne County, the prosecutor's office, where she ended up divorcing her first husband, met her second husband, and married Terrence Boyle was his name. So hence she is Patricia Boyle. By the 1976, she's decided she wanted to be in Detroit Recorder's Court. Some of you might remember that was the criminal court in Detroit at the time. She was a very well-respected judge. There was an article about her, about judges. They asked attorneys what they thought of all the judges in Recorder's Court, and she ranked number 1. So that was pretty cool. She, soon after, in 1978, was appointed by President Carter, who was trying to diversify the federal bench. Similar to those statistics in state courts, in 1976, there were 399 district court judgeships in federal courts. Of those, 3 were active judges were women, and there were only 2 women who were on senior status in the whole of the United States. So this is 2 years later. She's one of very few women that have come to the court. One other thing that I want to just sort of point out, this is going back to when she was in the Recorder's Court. She was appointed when she got to Recorder's Court. And it was actually controversial, in part because her husband worked in the prosecutor's office. He did not ever show up in court. He didn't ever argue cases, but he was the one assigning the assistant prosecutors. And so one of the local bars was arguing that he should, that the appointment should be rescinded because of that could be a conflict of interest. Justice Boyle, who was described by a friend in a quote in the newspaper at some point, not necessarily with this, that she was described as earthy. She told the media what she thought, and she thought it was sexist that a woman could be controlled by her husband in such a way. And if she hadn't been a woman, this wouldn't have even been brought up. So she was one to speak her mind. I don't think this went anywhere because she stayed on Recorder's Court, of course, until she was appointed for the federal bench. Which leads us to her coming to the Michigan Supreme Court in 1983. Of course, we know that Justice Riley left the court. And so Governor Blanchard had to come up with someone to fill the position instead. And he came to Justice Boyle. She's got this federal appointment, lifetime position. And she really had to think about it when she was approached. Did she want to leave this position to come to the Supreme Court? But the court was in the midst of crisis, and she made that decision. She credits several people with helping her make the decision, including her husband, who then later ended up becoming a circuit court judge. Of course, you know that Justice Riley joined her after the next election. And although they didn't necessarily agree philosophically, it's obvious from their work together that they did figure out how to work closely together, even though when they were, that it was sort of a contentious time on the court. And she also ended up forming, along with Justice Riley, the half of the Michigan's first female majority in 1997. You can see here in the top right corner, Justice Boyle is seated on the left, and Justice Riley is seated on the right. Behind them is, on the left, is Justice Weaver, and then Justice Marilyn Kelly. And they were extraordinarily excited to be together because they were all people who had been one of the few women in the room themselves, and to have 4 on the bench at one time was pretty amazing at that point. Justice Boyle retired in 1998, and really she just said she was ready for a long vacation. There wasn't much more explanation other than that. So she had done what she was ready for, and then was ready to move on to other things, apparently. And then sort of to wrap up talking about Justice Boyle, I have the Tupperware story that gets repeated every once in a while. The idea is that, and this came up at her retirement, and it's part of one of the special sessions that the Supreme Court had, that apparently when she first joined the court, she was the only woman, and she was really trying extraordinarily hard to make her way. And she was at conference. The court meets 1 day per week in conference about cases and administrative issues. And she said, "Wait a minute, I need to go to my office and find something that I left on my desk. I'll be right back." And when she got back, the room was empty except for one poor staffer who was left to explain that the other justices had someplace to be. Well, she finally got the staffer to admit that they were all golfing and they had not invited her. And so immediately she fired off a memo, which apparently had been saved, because this is quoted by a different justice who was speaking on this about 15 years later, saying, "Well, you guys had to leave conference early. I'm just here to advise you that I need to leave next week early so I can go to a Tupperware party with Justice Coleman." So she handled being the only woman in the room often, apparently, with humor, because I've seen several references to different times when she did that. And one person I talked to that knew Justice Boyle later in life said she just had this wonderful laugh. So it's an interesting way to handle what could have been a very tough situation there. So I'm going to sort of leave it here if there are any questions. Or
yes, we have a couple of questions. The first question is, are there any posters available featuring these 3 justices or other women justices on the court? Someone is looking to do a display on women in the law for her students. So are there any materials available for sale, maybe through the Learning Center, or how would you advise somebody to get photos and posters?
Oh my goodness. I'm trying to think if I don't know of any posters of these women. The the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society has photos of their portraits, and they have the copy of the photo of the four women together there. I'm not sure, there's nothing that's been created that sort of thing, but I would say if you're looking for images, to contact it's micourthistory.org, I think you can get there. Carrie Sampson is the person who is the executive director there. Send her an email and see how you might get permission to use those at least. They also have all of the justices' biographies on their website, so you could see their portraits and things like that. I also, the Learning Center has an exhibit. In fact, I have a photo of it sort of at the very end. So we've got that information. I don't know if it's online. I don't think I have all the information on the exhibit online, but we do have a newsletter that that you can get to, that's about women in the law, that has their photos on it too, kind of thing. But it's not a poster. So those are my ideas.
Okay, and so what would be the best way for our audience to get on the list to get the newsletter?
Oh, sure. They could send me an email, or you go to our website, and how about I can chat. The end of my presentation has my email address, but you're certainly welcome to chat out my email address, and they could send me an email, and that's probably the easiest way, because I got to tell you a bunch of steps to get to the newsletter. It's not on the front page there.
Okay, great. And then one other question, did Justice Boyle ever express regret about leaving the federal bench for the Supreme Court?
She was asked about it a lot, because people frankly thought she was crazy. I mean, if you ask somebody who knew the story at the time, they all just thought she was crazy to want to go back to running for office. I recently rewatched a C-SPAN from 1984, and she's like, I did it because the court was in crisis and the state needed me. And but the other thing she did a little bit later, when she did her oral history, which was, after she had left the court, she was reflecting on it, and she really, as a federal judge, she was a district court judge, so she was a trial court judge, working alone, didn't see fellow judges very often, and she really felt kind of cut off from her colleagues, whereas she enjoyed the fact that when she was on the Michigan Supreme Court, there was a collegial court, so she'd be able to have those discussions about court cases. So I think the contact with her colleagues was a really important reason that she enjoyed being on the court.
We just received another question. Is there a way to read the oral history of Justice Boyle?
Yes, it is available. Just you can do an internet search. The oral histories both of Justice Coleman and Justice Boyle and several other justices were done by the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society, and you can listen to them, but they're also available to download the PDF. So if you wanted to find something particular, you can search it. They're hosted by the MSU Library, the Vincent Voice Library. So just do an internet search for, Patricia J. Boyle interview, and the top hit will be the MSU Library link there.
And I think someone has a story. So someone has an anecdote about Justice Boyle's reasons for moving to the Michigan Supreme Court, and that is Kathy. So come on, Kathy, let's hear it.
I clerked for Judge Boyle in the United States District Court from 1980 to 1982. And I had just started as an associate at Dykema when the governor called Justice Boyle and asked her to make a leap to the Michigan Supreme Court and give up her lifetime tenure. She actually refused him the first time. And then he really worked on her, and she called around to her group of wise people and people whose perspectives she valued when he asked her a second time, and ultimately she accepted it. One of her reasons, and you've captured two of the reasons. There was a third reason too. When she was on the federal district court, because she had been a prosecutor and a recorder's court judge, she was known in the criminal defense community as a very strict judge on criminal matters. You know, not quite a hanging judge, but very tough on criminal defendants. And as a result, the defendants when she was on the federal district court bench all pled. And she didn't get to try criminal cases, and criminal law was her first love. And so she felt that in addition to the other factors that you've mentioned, Rachel, that she would have more opportunity to toil in the vineyards of criminal law on the Michigan Supreme Court than she was having in her lifetime appointment on the federal bench. Plus, she'd never have to try another patent case again. So that's what I would add to the milieu in which she made that decision the second time to go to the Michigan Supreme Court. Everybody did think she was crazy, but you know, comfort and money were never a priority for her. She was an extraordinarily bright woman. She was first in her class in law school, first in her graduating class. So very, very bright person.
Thanks for adding that, Kathy. And also, by the way, you got a shout out in the chat. So thank you very much.
That's my good friend, Erin Giannopoulos. Another very bright woman.
True.
Wonderful.
Is there anything else? It looks like the chat, we've addressed everything. Some compliments for you, Rachel, and our gratitude for sharing this information with us. It's been very informative, and we really appreciate hearing about these first three very important women in the history of our state.
Wonderful. I have a little bit more from the women currently on the court. If you have a few more minutes, we can certainly do that. And I also want to say thank you to Kathy for adding that nuance, because I never knew Justice Boyle. In the sources, it talks about how she really had that interest in criminal law, and so it was probably something that was unspoken, that probably everybody at the time knew that was it, but that wasn't part of the story that was spoken. So I'm glad to have that connection. That's really great to hear that. So but to sort of wrap up to where we were at the beginning is today. That when I started the program, I had that quote from the Chief Justice about how it's important to kids today to see women in leadership. And one of the first times I was trying out this presentation, somebody said, "Well, what did the current women think about these women that came before them?" And so I asked the other three women on the currently on our court about, what did you think? And then, they all had things that are woven throughout the presentation. They were awed by the drive and determination and passion, and that they really thought that they had important things to say to our court today. On a personal level, some of the things, Justice Clement, she said, Justice Boyle had children during law school and her early career, and that these women all in different ways made many sacrifices. But for her, one of the important things is that these women did that because they were remembering that this was a job that was something bigger than themselves, which I think is an important statement for people who are in leadership of any kind. Talked to Justice Kavanaugh, who actually has a personal connection because her father served with Justices Riley and Boyle on the court as a colleague. And she's of the generation where she was the first generation, she feels, that saw women in leadership as a norm, in part because of these women. And she said she, on a regular basis, saw how much respect her father had for these two women. He served for a decade and a half with them. And she commented that this kind of visibility matters. And she so hopes that children, including her own, are going to continue to think that women being in this sort of leadership position is still important and should be pursued as a norm. And then finally, the last quote I have is from Justice Welch, who's the junior justice on the court. And she brought out the whole idea that not only does our court have its case deciding job, where the cases that come before it and they make those decisions, but they also have the administrative duties that go along with that. And in some ways, the court has more can decide more which things to focus on. And these three women, all in their own way, really brought a lot into that administrative field. Mary S. Coleman, when she was on the court, she not only had a commission to study how best to permanency plan for children in foster care, but she also took on the heavy lift of reorganizing Wayne County and Detroit courts at the time that people thought was probably impossible. And then Justice Riley and Justice Boyle both worked on commissions that studied gender and race and ethnicity issues within the law at the time, and brought forth some of those things that maybe some other people didn't see. And it's something that our court is still working on. There are a lot of issues of both civil and criminal jurisdictions that they're thinking about how can we have greater access to justice. And so with those ideas, they're continuing that legacy of those first three women. So not only were they a personal inspiration, but they were also an inspiration for the current work of the court today. So I think that was really an interesting set of observations from all of these women on the role of the first women of the court. So with that, that's sort of the end. If there's anything else, I'm happy to answer any additional questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. And if you want to visit our website, it's up on the screen there. You can also send me an email if you have any questions or want to find something. We got lots of great stuff on our website. We will be starting scheduled tours beginning next month, but it'll be a little bit before we have any openings. That lots of school groups come in the springtime. So, but certainly send me an email and we can get you on the schedule if you'd like to come and see the gallery and the Learning Center, including the first women on the court. Although I've told you a lot of the stories, there's a couple things that are in there that aren't in my presentation. So thank you.
Okay, well, it looks like we have no more questions. There is a lot of gratitude and appreciation for this interesting and informative presentation. Again, we really appreciate you talking with us today and sharing this inspiration with us, because really, I think that's my big takeaway from learning about these three women. So if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and conclude the program then. Okay, thank you and have a great day, everybody.